Hi, everyone. March is Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month. And ever since I lost my husband, Jay, to the disease in 1998 when he was just 42 years old, I have been a staunch advocate for awareness and early detection. The number of colon cancer cases among young people under the age of 50 has risen dramatically. The disease is now the leading cause of death for men under the age of 50 and the second leading cause of death of women under 50. So, why is this happening? Dr. Andrea Cercek is the co director of the Center for Young Onset Colorectal and Gastrointestinal Cancer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. Dr. Cercek, thank you so much for being here. March, as you know, is Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month, and I wanted to talk to you about the really alarming increase of colorectal and other digestive cancers among people under the age of 50. Can you tell us about what you've been seeing and why you find this so concerning?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It is alarming. We're seeing more and more young people, and this has been happening really since the mid 1990s. There's been this slow and steady rise of a few percent per year with colorectal cancer in individuals under the age of 50. And I think what's scariest is that this is not unique to the United States or to other developed countries, but it's really happening all over the world. Every country that has a registry or is starting to kind of gather their data are noticing this rise. And it's predominantly in left-sided tumors, what's called the descending colon or the rectum. So there are these commonalities across the globe that really we have not been able to explain.
In addition to the increase in colorectal cancer, you're seeing an uptick in other so called digestive cancers. What are those cancers specifically?
Yeah, so other cancers that are on the rise include really they're all digestive cancers. So of the esophagus, stomach, pancreas, appendix, the entire digestive tract is rising in young individuals.
Tell us a little bit about the patient population you're seeing at Memorial Sloan Kettering.
We're seeing many, many patients under the age of 50. Most of our patients, I would say, are in their early 40s, but we've seen as young as teenagers, adolescents, where we really, can't explain it. The parents get a colonoscopy, they don't even have a single polyp, and yet here are these teenagers with colorectal cancer. That's rare, but we're seeing it, I would say, more and more each year, which we weren't used to. And so, many of our patients are, as I mentioned, in their 30s, their 40s, they're starting their careers, they're thinking about family planning, they're young parents, they're taking care of their aging parents. They don't particularly have any of the obvious or the known risk factors that we think about with colorectal cancer, such as smoking, obesity, alcohol use, red meat. And some of them are so young that even if they did smoke for a little bit, they simply can't actually have smoked enough, let's say, to, say that this might be a risk factor for their cancer. So most of them are quite fit and active, and really we have not seen any kind of obvious, explanation.
This must be so upsetting for you to treat these patients because colorectal cancer often presents itself when there are symptoms, and that can mean the cancer has advanced.
You're absolutely right. And especially in this patient population where screening is not indicated, right? We know now the screening age has been lowered to 45 because of this rise. But as I mentioned, we're seeing many people in their 30s and their 40s. And so they're not getting screened. So therefore, the tumors are not caught in very early stages, and they really present when they have symptoms. And oftentimes that's because the cancer is quite advanced and many times actually has already spread. So, stage 4. And so it's devastating. And from just why me? Why did this happen? How did it happen? What did I do wrong? What didn't I do? To, how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to support my family? Um, and what happens even in survivorship or if they don't survive, it's incredibly difficult.
It's heartbreaking. And many of these people do not have a family history of colorectal cancer. And I think it's worth noting that 75% of colorectal cancer cases have no family history. And I always say no family history is no guarantee that you won't be diagnosed with the disease. But again, many of them don't have a family history.
Many of them don't. Many of them don't, or many of them also don't know about it until until they tell their families about their diagnosis, and then it's like, oh, so and so had it, and an aunt had it, etc. So it's just not talked about. But most of these patients don't have a family history, don't have any reason to kind of even think about an early screening or talking to their primary care physicians about early screening, because it's not anywhere on their radar.
I think the big question is, why is this happening? Why are so many young people under the age of 50 being diagnosed with colorectal cancer and, in most cases, advanced colorectal cancer? That is the $1 million question.
Absolutely.
I'm curious to hear what you believe is the cause.
You're absolutely right. That is the $1 million question. I think the short answer is we don't know. The longer and I think increasingly more exciting answer is that there is now a lot of work going into this. There are many, research centers focusing on it, many collaborations from an epidemiological perspective, just kind of smaller basic science research to try to figure this out. Most likely this is environmental. I think we all agree that there is an environmental factor or factors that everyone is exposed to. This is the only really explanation that makes sense for why we're seeing this pattern, this rise all over the world. But what those factors are, we don't know. And so, the suspects are anywhere from processed foods, microplastics, things that are kind of, that we're exposed to that we ingest without even knowing it. Or we do know things like antibiotics, potentially other medications. All of this kind of is out there now under investigation.
Well, let's go through some of these theories. One is, as you mentioned, ultra processed foods, and the overconsumption of these foods can also lead to obesity, which is a known risk factor for colorectal cancer. Can you talk about what scientists are trying to learn about the impact of ultra processed foods on our bodies?
Yeah, I think the ultra processed foods and anything that they might the hormones that go into them, et cetera, that's definitely under investigation. People are looking at it in terms of exposures, risk factor questionnaires. What did you eat as a kid? Have you eaten most, as a young adult? Those types of questions. And then on a more sort of basic science, kind of molecular scale, how do those foods affect our metabolism? Is there sort of more of an inflammatory state because of all these ultra processed foods that really everyone is ingesting, even, despite some of our best efforts?
Let's talk about another theory, microplastics. Why do scientists believe they could be the culprit?
Microplastics, when digested, there are, lots of data there can lead to estrogens, lead to hormone production, changes in hormones within the body. And some of those hormonal changes can lead to inflammation. So there has been description of microplastics actually found in our organs, in the heart, in brains, literal deposits of microplastics. We know that they are everywhere in the environment. Even people who don't eat red meat, they're all over the ocean. They're in the fish we eat. That's been known for a long time. We know that there are general shifts in the hormones, presumably from microplastics. There has not been a direct link, but that's certainly one of the, I would say, very high up on the sort of ladder in terms of suspects. But it's very, very difficult to demonstrate that the changes from just ingesting these microplastics, that we're truly ingesting them, that they exist, and then secondarily that all of these changes lead to cancer. And I think an even more important and tougher question is, if this is something that we're all exposed to, why are these individuals, certain individuals, developing cancer and others are not? So there is still very likely some group of individuals that are predisposed. And so I think those are the key things that we need to think about when we do research is what are the culprits potentially that are causing these changes in our bodies, and then who's more susceptible to actually developing a cancer from those changes.
In addition to microplastics, there are other theories. One is PFAs, or these so-called forever chemicals that are found in a lot of products. Can you tell us why scientists are looking at those?
It's for the same reasons as with microplastics. We know that exposure to these substances and these chemicals can lead to changes in our metabolic pathways, in our hormones. And so the question is, what are those changes exactly, and how might those changes be leading to specifically digestive cancers and potentially other cancers as well?
There's also a fear about the over prescription of antibiotics. I know when my kids were little, and even a few years ago for myself, if you had an infection, you were quick to be prescribed an antibiotic when it wasn't necessarily bacterial, but viral, and antibiotics wouldn't have a big impact. How has the overprescription of antibiotics come into play in terms of the increased risk of colorectal and other digestive cancers?
Absolutely. That's one of the other really main suspects is antibiotic use, because what antibiotics do is they change what's called the microbiome, or the bacterial world that exists within our digestive tract, where we need good bacteria and we have potentially some bad bacteria. And the concern is that the antibiotics may get rid of some of the good or protective bacteria and allow the bad bacteria that are pro-inflammatory and that could lead potentially to cancer to overgrow. So it's a very delicate balance, and why we're investigating antibiotics specifically is because we know that antibiotics can eradicate certain types of bacteria.
Let's talk more about the microbiome, because there is, I know, some thinking that microplastics may be piercing the microbiome somehow, not only changing your hormonal level, but kind of affecting the delicate balance, causing inflammation, because some of these particles may penetrate sort of the mucous membrane around the microbiome. Not to be gross, and I hope I'm being scientifically semi-accurate, but the microbiome seems to be the real key to understanding this, right?
We think so, we think so because it's really a whole world, right? The microbiome, it's not just sort of these are our bacteria, but it's in the interaction between the bacteria, how they protect us, how they help us. And so that's why this microbiome is under such investigation. The issue is that there are a lot of things that can change our microbiome. It's dynamic. It's a huge universe. It's very different, from if you're eating something, you're used to a diet on the East Coast of the US and you travel, let's say, to Asia. There have been studies that have shown that within a week, the microbiome that we can identify changes drastically. So it's a very, very hard thing to kind of capture, saying, okay, this is definitely the culprit. This is what these are the changes, these are the bacteria that the patients has. But we are starting to see some signs that there might be some bacteria that some of these young patients do have in common, that could perhaps have led to this. So we're making some progress, but it is a really sort of, I would say, like as big as the microbiome is, it's the heart of a question, to tackle.
It is such a challenging question. At the same time, young people are being diagnosed and many are dying of this disease. Having said that, epidemiological studies can be super hard to conduct, and proving correlation is one thing, proving causation is another. So can you talk about the challenges of really pinpointing what may be the cause, and if in fact you're starting to think it might be multifactorial?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's exactly as you said, it's a huge challenge just in general conducting epidemiologic studies. You need large numbers, you need multiple different populations. Thankfully, those research projects are ongoing. There is now worldwide collaboration. It can't be done just from a single center. This is our small population. It really needs to be thousands, hundreds and thousands of patients, to find the answer. So I think those are absolute challenges. But as you said, the investigation is underway. There's more and more funding, more and more grant support, which is key to finding the answer.
Can you explain what the birth cohort effect is?
Yeah, so this is very interesting, and I think really kind of pins down the sort of the crux of the problem, or where everything began. What we see is that the rise really started with the birth cohort of 1950 and later. And if, I could show you the graph, it's sort of a flat line, and then all of a sudden, after people born in 1950, there's the slow and steady rise, and the slope just keeps going up and up. And what that really tells us is that it's something environmental, that it's something that people born in the 1950s might have been exposed to maybe in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but we are continuously being exposed.
There have been some other theories, and I'm curious what you think of them. One, I was talking to an expert in the microbiome at MD Anderson, and they were wondering if protein, not naturally occurring protein, but protein powder, some of this ultra processed protein you find in nutrition bars, may be contributing to it, because they're seeing many just elite athletes and marathon runners and people who are in incredible shape being diagnosed with colon cancer.
I agree. I think that we see that over and over, just, fit people who are always fit, no obesity even in childhood and young adulthood. I think it's certainly possible. The question, that I have is I don't know enough about protein bars and protein powder to say that that might be used as much here in the US as it is, in Asia, Australia, or even in Africa, where we're also seeing this rise. And so that would be the maybe kind of, make me question potentially that this is all it is, but maybe this is another contributing factor, which is what I suspect it is that it's really multifactorial.
A 2021 study that you led found that the biology of colorectal cancer is very similar in younger and older patients. What does that mean, and how does it impact your research?
So this was our first question when we started out was, what is the biology of young onset colorectal cancer? Do the tumors under the microscope and when we look at their genes or their mutations look the same in a 30-year-old as they do in an 80-year-old, for example, which would be the average onset? So we compared the two, and what we found was that under the microscope and then genomically, when we sequenced the tumors and looked at the genetic signatures that make up the tumor that presumably cause it to form and to grow, look exactly the same. So this suggested to us that it's not a new disease. It's not a different, something changed and now we're seeing kind of this new version of colorectal cancer. It's the same colorectal cancer that's occurring in 80-year-olds as is occurring in 30-year-olds. So from that, we presume that the pathway, meaning where you form a polyp and then there's mistakes being made or mutations that kind of accumulate and then ultimately a cancer forms, that pathway is the same in an average onset patient in their 60s, 70s, or 80s as it is in a 30 or 40-year-old. So that process is the same, we believe, but we do think that perhaps later on, there's more that goes on once those genes, those mutations are translated into what are called proteins and the way that our cells are formed and interact. On that level, there might be differences, but the way that the cancer first starts and grows really looks to be the same.
So our immune response may be different when we're older, and our immune system isn't as strong as it is when we're younger, but basically it is the same cancer and it's not some kind of variation. Talk about the exposome, which is a complement to the genome, and I understand it represents the cumulative impact of our environment on our health. So how is that being utilized in your research?
That's another area that research are investigating, and it effectively is a very beautiful sort of scientific summary of what we've been discussing. Is that we have our genetic makeup, then we have changes that occur to our genetic makeup because of environmental factors and things that we're exposed to, and we know that cancer requires multiple sort of changes to happen, and this is one of the areas that's being investigated.
Let's talk about early detection and prevention. As scientists try to figure out why this is happening, there are certain things people can do. When it comes to early detection, however, the screening age is 45 and over, and you're seeing patients in their 20s, 30s, even early 40s. My husband, Jay, was diagnosed at 41. So for them, the screening guidelines don't really help. So what can people do? And as we've mentioned, if you're symptomatic, it's often too late. So how can people get early detection, and how can they prevent this disease?
Absolutely. It's so important. I think for now, the best we can do is tell people if you have persistent symptoms, if you have a change in bowel habits, bleeding, unexplained weight loss, abdominal pain, get medical attention. Don't just kind of ignore it, try to fight it off. See your primary care provider and say, listen, this is what's happening. It may be nothing, but it's really important to have that conversation and potentially that workup. Screening techniques will improve. That's definitely, lots of ongoing research in terms of early detection, easier ways other than the colonoscopy. For now, the colonoscopy is far and away the best test because not only does it detect the cancer, it can prevent it because we can catch that polyp before it forms. But unfortunately, it's just we're not able to lower the screening guideline because the number of individuals required to be screened right would be huge. So it's just not something that's doable. So for now, the most important thing is raising awareness, being your own advocate, and then also on behalf of the physicians, primary care providers, gastroenterologists, if there's this complaint, it could be colorectal cancer, so the patient needs a workup.
Some of my followers are asking about at-home stool tests for screening. You're right, they can't remove polyps, but how effective are they?
They're great. They are effective. I think they detect blood. I think if nothing else, that absolutely should be done. There's many screening programs out there where you can do the home stool test, and then if it's positive, you'll be called in for a colonoscopy. So I highly recommend that. If for some people it's just very difficult to get the colonoscopy done, any test is really better than no test. So absolutely.
What about diet and exercise? I know that that's something that you can do proactively. And specifically, I'd like to ask you about probiotics, naturally occurring probiotics, and the role they may play in overall gut health, if you will.
We don't know the answer to that. I think I tell many of my patients that natural occurring probiotics, such as eating yogurt, are fine to take.
Fermented food like
Fermented food,
sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, things like that can be helpful, right?
absolutely. They can definitely be helpful. I don't, think that they can be harmful. Sometimes in our own patients, it's a challenge because of change in bowel movements, but for the general public, they can definitely be helpful. A healthy diet that we should all be eating, high in fruits and vegetables, fish, chicken, low in red meat, is important and can be beneficial. Exercise is hugely important. We know in terms of prevention, in patients that are colorectal cancer survivors, there are data that daily exercise and a healthy diet actually improve outcomes. There are data for actually cancer fighting just from exercise itself, and so that's becoming more important, in our daily lives. So those are definitely things that someone can do and proactively to live a healthier lifestyle to try to prevent this.
They're also exciting new blood tests, but they're on the horizon and they've yet to be perfected that might help people identify circulating microscopic cancer cells, which I think might be easier than a colonoscopy. But I'm always hesitant to mention those things because I don't want people to put off getting screened with the techniques we have at our disposal now, especially given that only 20% of people 45 to 49 have been screened for colorectal cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think the blood tests are great that they're available. I love that the technology is in development. I think it will continue to get better, more sensitive, more specific. But as you said, beautifully, it's not enough. If at all possible, definitely the colonoscopy is the right test because it can be preventative.
Someone also asked about when they should be screened, telling us their grandmother passed away from colon cancer before the age of 50. And this is a good time to remind people, Andrea,
45.
that you should be screened. Actually, if your grandmother died or was diagnosed, depending on when they were diagnosed, if she was diagnosed at 48, you need to get your colon cancer screening 10 years prior at 38. So, for example, my girls will get, one has already been screened at 31, the other will be screened when she's 31 because my husband was diagnosed at 41. So, any first line relative, right, like mother, father, sibling, aunt, grandmother, should you go ahead and get screened 10 years
10 years
before they were
younger.
diagnosed?
Yes, absolutely. 10 years younger. And that's why it's important to know your family history. It's important to ask those questions. Even if you don't have symptoms, just, have that conversation because yes, you may be eligible to get screened 10 years younger. And if not, then 45 is the screening age. I think there's still a lot of work, for us to do to really get that word out that the age has now been lowered to 45 because of this rise.
Yes, and I don't think a lot of people realize it. And this is one of the things I wanted to convey during the course of this interview and during Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month. While scientists continue to figure out why this is happening, how long do you think it will take before we can point to factors that may be contributing to this rise?
More and more data are coming out of, hints and clues that are hopefully not just associations, but that we're finding, potential culprits. So I think it's hard for me. I wish I knew and I could tell you the exact time, but I think over the next several years, we're going to make a lot of progress.
In the meantime, people need to practice healthy lifestyles, talk to their doctors and about probiotics. I'm curious that there are other countries that have a lower incident of colorectal cancer. I remember when I did a lot of work in this area, I thought Japan had a lower incidence of colorectal cancer. And when Japanese people moved to Hawaii or up the United States and adapted a more Americanized diet, their incidence of colon cancer went up. Is that true?
That's true. And there were data to that end exactly because of the Western diet and the sort of more common risk factors for right-sided colorectal cancer. This finding in young adults is pretty universal. There were a few countries in Europe where there didn't seem to be this rise. And the thought initially was like France, for example, they regulate their food very much, GMO, et cetera. But they've actually recently found that they also have increased rates of young onset colorectal cancer. So it's not, seems to be that no one's really spared.
Many of my followers asked about IBS or Crohn's and colitis. If you have any of those, are you at higher risk of colorectal cancer and when should you get screened?
So it's a really important distinction that needs to be made between IBD, what's called inflammatory bowel disease, which is Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, which do predispose people to colon cancer. Because what those are effectively is your colon is kind of constantly inflamed from the body attacking it. And that can lead to changes and it can lead to cancer. So that's been well described and known. And patients who have that diagnosis must be screened on a regular basis. It's super, super important. I can't stress that enough. IBS is inflammatory bowel syndrome, which is kind of a very broad diagnosis that, young adults often get. It can be stress related. It can just be a change in GI habits for whatever reason, different foods. Most of the time, it's associated with stress and anxiety, which unfortunately many, many young people have, and that's on the rise as well. But what happens with IBS is that many times these changes happen and they're just attributed to IBS because it's this kind of umbrella, broad diagnosis, but the person doesn't necessarily have a workup, doesn't have a colonoscopy. They might have change in bowel habits, pain with bowel movements, anything like that, with that diagnosis really should have a colonoscopy to make sure that it's not anything else that's going on. And then, of course, the IBS can be managed.
You and Dr. Luis Diaz at Memorial Sloan Kettering did a very exciting clinical trial dealing with rectal cancer and immunotherapy. And the patients had an extraordinary response. I'm curious if immunotherapy is applicable to colorectal cancers in general and if progress is being made. Because while I want to focus on early detection and prevention, I also would love to give some hope to people who are dealing with advanced colorectal cancer at this point in time.
Absolutely. We're making tons of progress with treatment of advanced disease as well as early stage disease. Our study was for a small population with mismatch repair deficiency, which is known to be very sensitive to immunotherapy, either in early stage or also in advanced disease. For most patients with colorectal cancer, it's about 95, 90+% of them have tumors that are not on their own sensitive to immunotherapy, because what happens is the cancer actually hides from their own immune system. It kind of finds ways to cover itself. And so if the immune system doesn't see it as something foreign, then it doesn't want to attack it. So there's lots of great research going on, and lots of progress has actually been made with that patient population where the immune system normally doesn't recognize the tumor, to try to get it to recognize the tumor. And we're starting to see some responses. So it is absolutely really exciting. People should definitely have hope. We are super excited as a research community. In advanced disease, about 20 or so % of patients are starting to have responses to new drugs. There's new combinations ongoing with immunotherapy. And the goal is obviously to extend the success that we saw with this mismatch repair deficient rectal cancer population to areas outside of the rectum, but then also to the tumors that are not mismatch repair deficient, to see those same responses with immunotherapy.
And again, we want to remind people that most colorectal cancer cases have no family history. Isn't it 72 or 75% of cases?
Just about, yes, around 70% of all cases. And in young individuals, it's close to 65%. We still have a higher proportion of hereditary cancers in young individuals, but this rise that we're seeing is driven by no family history and sporadic tumors, or what are called, random tumors that can just occur without any predisposition.
I always say your family history could start with you. And that's why everyone needs to get screened. These are such important things to know and understand, not only during March, but all year long. And people really need to be screened, because it's one of these cancers that can be stopped in its tracks, because as you said, the colon is kind of this human casing. And if you can get it before it penetrates the colon wall, goes into the lymph nodes and becomes sort of microscopic disease that can metastasize on other organs, your chances of being cured are very, very high.
Absolutely.
Well, Andrea Cercek, thank you so much. I could talk to you about colon cancer all day, but you're busy saving lives and helping patients. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.